Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kim Maida. I'm the Senior Director of Developer Relations at Fusion Auth. And we're really excited to have the opportunity to sit down with some of the experts in identity who are going to be sharing their knowledge and insights with AuthCon attendees in New York City in May. Now, the format for this conversation will be pretty informal. I'd like to give a few minutes to each speaker to share the title and topic of your AuthCon talk, one practical actionable thing that people will learn or be able to do better or differently after hearing your talk, and an authentication challenge that is costing teams both time and money. So I am going to say your name, I will say your title, and then if you could please do these things, that would be awesome. So let's start with Hannah. So Hannah Sutor is the Principal Product Manager at GitLab.
Hi, everyone. I will be speaking at AuthCon about navigating the hidden complexities of identity, lessons from the trenches, really talking a lot just from my own personal experience over my career in terms of being on different identity teams, all with a slightly different bent, and some lessons I learned from each one. One thing I hope to give to you and that you can take away is a framework for evaluating whenever you're making decisions with authentication that will impact your end users and customers, how you can anticipate some of the challenges that may arise and hopefully save you from some of the pain and tough lessons learned that I've had over the years. I think an authentication challenge that's costing teams time and money is really authentication changes for non-human processes. So things like CI/CD, OAuth applications, and whenever there's changes in authentication there, whether it's the expiration of a credential or the person who set it up is no longer with the company and something breaks, it's extremely hard to track it down, figure out exactly what happened, and recover from that. And the scale is potentially much bigger than human authentication because you're not just impacting one person's login flow, but perhaps you're interrupting a business critical process. So I think that is an area where we can improve a lot in our industry.
Awesome. I will next call upon Hirsch. Singhal is a staff product manager at GitHub.
Hey, thanks. I'll be giving a talk about how we rolled out our 2FA mandate on github.com and tripled basically the number of users with 2FA on our platform, helping protect the software supply chain and really level up the way that we handle account security. I'm really hoping that folks can take away tips, tricks, best practices, some statistics even, to help with their own consumer-based 2FA rollout, if that is something that they are looking to do. One of the challenges that I particularly am focused on is not necessarily the authentication piece, but the account recovery piece that comes afterwards. That is something that we found was a major driver that influenced our 2FA rollout and is something that absolutely can cost a lot of time and money if you're not set up for it.
Right. And Heather Flanagan is the executive director at IDPro.
Yep, I wear lots of different hats. And the hat for this talk is going to be, it's about that single moment in time when your user clicks on your sign in or sign up button or login button. It kind of depends on what you call it. We haven't even standardized on that. The name of the talk is The New Gatekeepers, How Browsers Are Reshaping Your Customers' Login Experience. Some of the talk will be a little bit of a cheerful voice of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which is something I've been known as, because it is a lot. It is changing, and it's a change that is happening at the browser level. Browser used to be completely passive because you click on the button and it would be this conversation between a relying party and the identity provider, and the browser just didn't care, right? It's just passing stuff through back and forth. And then that changed for reasons, which I will talk about in this session. And And now the browser's like, okay, for one thing, we keep getting in trouble for this. And two, you know what? Maybe we can make this experience better. And that is where we're going to focus for the whole 25 minutes that I have in New York City. In terms of like overlooked challenges and the pains that your team may have, well, I'm going to go point right to this thing, which is the time and money that you've been spending on adapting to cookie deprecation, to iframes breaking, to hearing about this thing called FedCM. What is that, right? Well, it's a challenge and it's a huge opportunity. And for the people in consumer IAM, it's like a really good opportunity to influence what's going to happen next for your customers. So that's my presentation, and I hope you all are there and come to enjoy it.
Awesome. Thank you. Mike Gruen is the VP of Engineering at Layr.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm excited about the upcoming event. The title of my talk is CIAM in the wild. What we learned scaling from 1.5 to 3 million users. We did this initiative as part of a much larger replatforming initiative. So similar to Hannah's talk, it's like lessons from the trenches, but also this wasn't just let's just replace this one part of our product, but we are doing this against the backdrop of moving and migrating our entire stack from one system to another, and also while growing our user community base. So I think some of the lessons learned are really about managing that process, all of the decisions that went into, from requirements in the beginning to ever evolving requirements changes, how we did the user migration, working through some of those real world challenges, some of the things that we dealt with regard to performance throttling and other hiccups we ran into along the way. So I'm hoping that really what people take away from it is a sense of the lessons that we learned and then how they can apply them and sort of avoid the same mistakes that we made or plan for them at least. In terms of an authentication challenge, more so what my team, it's sort of top of mind right now, is with MFA and email-based MFA specifically, the amount of time we support users who, for whatever reason, aren't getting the emails. And I think trying to get them to log in, and we have these standards, and just really, I think there are definitely better ways to do MFA at this point. And but I think that a lot of people are just really based in this the system of text messages and emails, and then what happens when those don't go through, I think is costing people some time. Certainly my team has spent a lot of time trying to track down why emails aren't getting through.
Great. Thank you. So next is Matt Goodrich, Director of Information Security at Alteryx.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my talk is called Rant from the Other Side. And what I've noticed in sort of my, throughout my career, honestly, is that there's always these big pushy customers that tend to bring your corporations a lot of money, but at the same time, they like to throw their weight around so they can get what they want. I've chatted with some of my peers in the industry around this, and they all ask us for the same sort of things, but nobody really talks about what they are and sort of what you can expect from these Goliaths versus what's really table stakes. So customers, these big customers, they want things like SCIM, real-time audit log ingestion, an incredible amount of visibility into who's using what within your platform. Sometimes they want to use their own tokens. Of course, things like streamlined governance, those sorts of things. So planning to sort of walk through the common things that I've seen that these big customers want, and sort of how that parlays itself into the systems you choose to support identity within your product or your application. I'm hoping the audience obviously gets a good understanding of some of these things, and maybe it helps in their decisioning processes and their thought around making decisions that allow for maybe diverse standards use or flexibility in whatever products or patterns that they elect to use. In terms of an authentication challenge that I think's costing teams time and money, honestly, I think probably the biggest one that comes to my mind is session management. Even if you look at something like OAuth, there's two different single log-off standards, right? Nobody does session management exactly the same way. Some people are shoving tokens straight into cookies and hoping for the best. But session management, to me, also really heavily impacts the user experience, right? If you don't do it right, you're going to get lots of logouts. You could have some interesting race conditions that makes things harder to debug. Obviously, things like replay attacks become possible if you do it wrong. You could have sensitive information exposed, etc. So, to me, that's what I think is a huge challenge today.
Great. Next is Dan Erez, lead architect at Zim.
Hi, everyone. I'll talk about creating and validating schemas, mainly with AI. And in this talk, I'll share my experience about suitable and useful use cases for using schemas. And among other things, I'll talk about API schema creation validation, JWTs, JSON Web Tokens validations, and even how to format and validate AI responses, which is a hot topic now with all the MCP servers out there. And I think that the one thing I hope the audience will take is how to wisely do this creation and validation in schema, when to use AI for that and when not to use AI for schema validations. And regarding the authentication, I think it will be covered in the JWT part, in which I'll talk about weaknesses in this token. Like lots of companies are using JWTs, but there's a more secure alternative that I'll talk about, opaque tokens. Not many are using that, but I'll talk about that and show that it is more secure and recommend the audience to actually use it for the authentications. And that's it. Looking forward to it.
Dick Hardt, founder and CEO at Hello.
Hello. My talk is titled Less Oopsie with IPSY. IPSY is the interoperability profiling for secure identity in the enterprise, which is a huge mouthful for a standard. IPSY is a new working group in the OpenID Foundation, and it was formed because today, with all the different standards and building on what Matt talked about, what is his talk, it's very much a game of choose your own adventure as an enterprise, deciding which things do I want to do, what are my standards, and that's a huge challenge as a B2B SaaS vendor as you try to meet the security requirements that each enterprise has decided is what they need to have. And so in IPSY, we're looking to profile in a NIST-like manner different levels for both session lifecycle and identity lifecycle, so that an enterprise can say, I want IPSY IL1 and IPSY SL2, and it's clear on what that is on a profile across everything from DNSSEC to how you manage your certificates to which features you deploy in SAML or SCIM or OpenID Connect. And so what you should take away from my session is what this is, what the different levels are, why it's important, and how this in many ways is going to save you money as a B2B SaaS vendor, if that's the business you're in, and that you'll be able to know, okay, I support IPSY level 1 or 2 or 3, and the effort of figuring out whether you comply and having a security audit with the enterprise should drop dramatically if you can say you have that and you've been audited to have that everybody's talking about the same thing, and that there's a lot more standardization around what you need to do to set up federation.
What's an authentication challenge that's costing teams time and money?
The challenge is, what do I need to do for a given enterprise? And everybody has a separate idea about what's needed. And so if we standardize that, then it's like I meet, session level 3 and we're good to go, as opposed to, oh, you want a different token, or you want a different logout, or you want a different thing here, that we've said as to here's the best practice, and everybody adopts those best practices, as opposed to each enterprise having their own snowflake idea about what they need for security.
Great. Gabriel Manor, VP of Developer Relations at Permit.io.
Yeah, hi. So my talk title is not about authentication. I'm going to talk about authorization, as the company I work for point. And the fancy title of it is the unspoken trade-offs of fine-grained authorization. Actually, fine-grained authorization is not spoken enough. So I'm going to speak about unspoken of unspoken. And the field of fine-grained authorization is new. And as anything in software development, it has trade-off when it comes to implement it or to implement in your system. I'm going to talk about the two main approaches in the field: policy as code and Google Zanzibar, or policy as graph. Yeah, same then. Good to see your face here, by the way. And so I'm going to talk about the various trade-offs that you need to consider when implementing this kind of complex feature in your application. The one thing that the audience will learn, so first they will learn about fine-grained authorization and the main approaches there, but in more depth, they will learn about the implication of business logic data on permissions decision. The authentication challenge that costs time and money, I would talk about the authorization challenge. I think sometimes the wrong decisions that create trade-offs after. So for example, going with complex policy rules instead of modeling data-based rules can cost a lot of money and workforce after. And yeah, it's kind of new topic, but I am too deep to that for the last 3 years. So I hope I will succeed to make it interesting enough for the audience.
Great, thank you. Shon Urbas, CTO at Pandium.
So my talk is OAuth 2.0. Is it really a standard? And it's exploring real-world implementations. My company, Pandium, we do a lot of B2B. We support B2B integrations, and so we're dealing a lot with different protocols for different partner systems. And depending on when you started reading about OAuth 2, or even if you started with OAuth 2 or started with OAuth or whatever the different RFCs now, you end up with very many different implementations of OAuth 2, with it not being really like concrete what you need to do to fix something. Sometimes an API endpoint will return a 500 if you add an extra client ID, while other ones require it. And so yeah, my talk is just a quick survey of my learnings over my career of like what OAuth 2 is and what it isn't, and we'll go through some actual practical examples. I think the biggest thing I want my audience to learn is it's not you, it's them. You're not an idiot for not fully understanding it. It is very, very, very complex and hard, and maybe it shouldn't be, but that's a whole separate issue. And then also talking about OAuth 2.1, which is supposed to clean up a lot of this, but it's just yet another standard. And then the biggest authentication challenge, I was just talking about this, and this comes up many times. It's around refresh tokens with OAuth 2 specifically. Whenever you have like many connections at scale, it's important for your refresh workflow to work and to be idempotent and to be resilient to basic HTTP errors and requests. And what we find a lot of the time is people are revoking their refresh tokens way too fast. And the next time you go and make a request to try to get an access token, you've lost it. And so this just costs literal time and money because you have to have people reconnect their integrations and get all that going. And I think this all comes from just it comes from the fact that OAuth 2, it talks a lot about like what you should do, but not necessarily how. And this is one of the things where I think it would be nice if we were prescriptive about how you should treat tokens. Thank you.
Dan Maher is Senior Developer Relations Engineer at Urbas.
Everybody, I'm Danielle, and the name of my talk is Patterns of Failure in Modern Auth. I specifically didn't put an N or a Z at the end of that because it's kind of about both. So basically, we're going to be looking at why it is that our outmoded ways of thinking about authentication and authorization are getting us in hot water today. And then I'm going to look at 3 basically case studies from major brands over the past few years that had critical failures in how they modeled or implemented Auth-N or Auth-Z or Auth-Z, American, and what the ramifications of that were. And then the biggest takeaway from this is basically how you can prevent being my next case study. So I'll actually explain how to not make the same mistakes that these these examples I'm going to provide made. I think it'll be a lot of fun. I appear to be the resident OPSEC nerd here, so my talk leans a lot more in that that direction. But definitely focused on Auth as the vehicle, right? In terms of a challenge that's costing teams time and money, there's already been a lot of really good ones, and that's the hard part about coming last, right? But to take perhaps an example from the talk a little bit, one of the big issues that a lot of organizations are facing is how to deal with legacy systems. When you start greenfield or even brownfield, you can implement with better practices or better ideas or better services, vendors, so on and so forth. But if you've got legacy systems that have been sitting around for 10, 15, 20 years, how can you take and do intelligent things there? And sometimes the answer is you can't really. And that in and of itself is a big time sink and a big money sink. So there you go.
Great. Thank you. I do want to take a moment to let folks make comments or respond to anybody's talk topics. I've seen the chat get kind of active in backstage. So if anybody wants to kind of share some of their thoughts with other speakers who are talking about things that they're interested in or that they have had their own experiences with, please speak up.
Oh, I was giggling hard over sometimes the enterprises, they'll push you around and they'll ask you to do things like implement Skim. What's wrong with implementing Skim? We love Skim.
Yeah, I was chuckling at that too. I was thinking about some of the changing requirements from my perspective, all the things that we, the project and at the beginning, all of these things that we said we needed to do. And then later on, we learned were maybe not as important. And especially to these enterprise customers that were like, yeah, this is a must have. And then when push came to shove, it turns out, no, they can live without it or whatever, and how to implement all that. So I was chuckling at some of that as well. And then also the session management. I made a comment about how I started my career as a software developer in '96, and session management was one of the biggest challenges we had back then, and nothing has changed. I guess it's because because HTTP is supposed to be stateless, and so the whole backbone of what we've built on isn't really like we've had to just add and add and add. It wasn't designed for web applications. It was meant to just serve up static content, stateless. So it's just kind of funny that nothing has changed.
I just looked up Gabriel on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, we need to grab coffee while we're at AuthCon because we attempted a Zanzibar migration back in 2022, and it was exactly those database patterns that tanked the whole project. And so, learning what should we have done sounds like required viewing for a bunch of folks in my authorization team. So I'm very excited for that one.
Similarly, I've been trying to convince my team to go to something more Zanzibar-like, but the ROI is always the thing that comes into question there for the amount of work that it would entail.
I'll say that I'm splitting my time half and half in the Zanzibar and Policy as Code team. So I'm a big fan of both of them. About GitHub, one of the players in the market also has all their examples of fine-grained authorization based on the GitHub model, but I do not use Zanzibar. Everything there is based on attribute-based access control and policy as code. So it's also going to be fun to talk about GitHub modeling with policy as data. And yeah, let's grab a coffee there all.
I wouldn't mind being a fly in the wall on that one too. Coming from I happen to be at an authorization vendor right now, and this is actually a new area for me personally. Coming as a crusty old sysadmin, then I was a DevOps engineer, and then I was an SRE, and then I was like, well, whatever they call me now, right? But this whole thing of like, we go through cycles in the industry where we have to reinvent the wheel every time. And I feel like we've reinvented the wheel a few times with authentication, and now maybe the wheel looks like a wheel, finally, right? But with authorization, we're still reinventing it every time. We haven't gotten to the wheel part yet, So this is, I think, an area that's ripe for not only conversation, but still definitely innovation and interesting things, for sure.
Kim, you asked about the difference between traditional identity conferences and customer identity. I think the authorization part of the picture is one of the biggest differences between the customer and workforce. Because in workforce, everything is probably kind of straightforward. People are belonging to organization. People are working in an office, they're working in a branch. But when it gets to customer, every application is completely different. The scale is completely different, and the self-service challenges is completely different. So when it comes to permission, it makes much more needs for fine-grained rules and rules that are dynamic and change on time and depend on data, and etc. So I think the customer side is way more interesting than the role explosion problem of workforce identity.
Definitely. I also think on that, one of the challenges I had at Cyber was we were B2B and B2C. So our B2C side and how that had to work and who had access to what, and then the B2B side had had other requirements, but they're still customers. So it's bringing all that in, and I definitely agree that that's one of the bigger differences.
I think the customer side, like the user experience, matters so much more than it does on the workforce side. Like you want low friction as possible on that side, whereas on the enterprise side, you can bug your own employees to do whatever you want, as much as you want. Not that you necessarily should, but it's a different world. But yeah,
marketing had a lot to do with. Marketing had a lot of say in how our plugins process and registration process worked.
So I think that's the perfect segue. I mean, we already started covering this, but this is the first CIAM conference. There are plenty of other identity events out there. This is probably going to be a bit different, right? I'm curious what folks think of kind of the audience demographic. How is that going to differ? What is different about the lessons that you want people to walk away with? We all went through them with our talk. Are those things more applicable to folks who would attend a CIAM conference versus, like, say, Identiverse or Identity Week?
Well, I mean, you can, as soon as you start to narrow down the subject matter, in this case, you're talking the CIAM, right? For me, that whenever I hear that acronym, though, I'm like, okay, are you consumer, citizen? You know, which C are you focused on? So that's an open question in my own head. I think you're going to get maybe more people who don't care so much about the use case where you can limit things because they can't. And that's something in enterprise that you can do a little bit more effectively, but not as effectively as some might think, especially if you're shifting out of, large enterprise. But what about small and medium enterprise? Do they have managed devices? Maybe, maybe not. Do they do more bring your own device, or do they assign things? It depends, right? With the consumer IAM, of course, you don't get to do any managed devices and you don't get to assign anything. So you've got this almost infinite level of possibility that's only constrained by what do the standards allow you to do and what do the regulations allow you to do. And that's more of what I expect to see here, both that a different set of constraints that are going to guide the conversations than you would see at, say, Identiverse or Identity Week.
I think it's also more applicable to a wider audience. I mean, you think about all the people who are involved in a consumer-facing or a customer-facing thing. You have product, you have marketing, you have all of these other people who maybe are not as involved in, other identity type events. So I think it's more broadly applicable. I think there's a lot of people who could take a lot of value and lessons learned from some of the talks that we're having.
And you have places like Identiverse or EIC. These are very insular, in some cases, sorts of spaces, right? The subject matter can be arcane. They can be extremely industry specific, extremely segment or sector specific. A lot of times these will also be, and not to say that these shouldn't exist, but there'll be a lot of closed door meetings or working group meetings. And even attending one of these events doesn't necessarily mean you're actually going to be getting high degrees of value or high contact time out of going, right? Whereas this, I think, presents an interesting opportunity to get that contact time and to get that more open door access to not only just the vendors, but also the practitioners, but also the in-between, right? So this is that first space where the people who are implementing and the people who are designing and the people who are ultimately using it can actually all come together and have a conversation about it.
And I guess to kind of expand on that, as experts in the space, what are you hoping to get from standing in the hallways and talking to people who are attending?
I'm excited about this conference because I think that it targets developers, which is really the people that I'm most interested in talking to, as opposed to, somebody running IT in a big enterprise, right? The CIAM solutions are something deployed by a developer around how do I enable my customers to use my app? And for me, that's very interesting. Personally, I'm also super interested, having led the design of what became JSON Web Tokens and OAuth 2 and involved in OAuth 2.1, of hearing the critiques from my fellow speakers about some standards that I developed. They're super successful, and like everything successful, people start using it in ways that you never envisioned early on, and hopefully I can pull some lessons out of them and questions from the audience about how do we make these things easier to use in the future. Having involved, right now I'm working on the JSON Web Token best current practices. So hopefully we'll learn something from that. And I'm also an author on the 2.1 and how do we try to make that more relatable to people. And I'm also excited to be talking to people about a new standard that dramatically simplifies identity lifecycle called OpenID Provider Commands. That is a dramatically simpler way of most of why people are deploying SCIM. And so people complaining about SCIM, does OP commands fill that need? So lots of coffees I'm hoping for.
similar. I'm excited to connect with other people, similar space. Like I've always been in the security, software development, IT, that overlap. And I think just giving me access to more people who are probably more like me, and then connecting and learning a lot about, how unique or how common has my experience has been. I'm really excited for a lot of the talks and learning from other people. I mean, we all learn from each other. And I think that's what I'm most excited about, is really just getting to network with a bunch of peers and people with similar interests and what I can learn.
Yeah, it's that peer access that I'm very excited for, both the other folks that are speaking and everybody in the audience that's trying to solve a lot of the same problems. Where are we all headed together? Who's rolling out passkey only user accounts, right? Like, let's have that discussion. What are we doing about security beyond just 2FA? These are things that we're all trying to figure out together. And I think if we're able to build momentum kind of as an industry, as a group, as a niche of the greater identity system, we can probably get some better things done together. So yes, +1 on the coffees.
I have to admit, for me, it's a lot of outreach. I've been talking about the Federated Credential Management API that's been under development for several years now, and it's kind of a fundamental change to what happens when you click that login button across, particularly in Chrome, but Mozilla is not far behind, and Apple, who knows. But that said, every time I've talked about it, there's been a goodly number of people in the audience who have no idea what's going on. They have no idea that these changes are coming, that they're happening, how to stay on top of them. And so if nothing else happens for me out of this conference, I'll have reached at least another dozen or 24 people who now have some awareness of what's going on, why, and how they can get more information.
Great. Well, we're already having a discussion, but I do have a few other questions that maybe will stoke some more discussion. So this one might be a little controversial, but what's the biggest auth question that you often answer with "it depends"?
All of them.
Wait, what auth question do you not answer with "it depends"?
Yeah.
I guess what's the most common one, or what's the one that you have a really good explanation for why it depends, that people can walk away from with a tidbit of knowledge? It's a hard one. There's so many.
I don't know. It's always how long will it take? Like, how long will X take? Whatever X is, I don't know. It depends.
I get asked a lot, like, can we use static tokens for this API? And largely, I'm like, you should probably use something like OAuth, right? But I'm also like, but they're like, but this is an internal API, blah, blah, blah. It's only available like on this specific network segment, and OAuth is a lot of overhead to do that. And I'm like, okay, maybe, I guess. But yeah, that's probably the one I get the most often. And I get it from pretty much every single team in the company, it feels like.
And then you can say, sure, you can do that, but do you mind signing this disclaimer first to make sure that I don't get in trouble for when you get compromised? Okay, thanks,
sign this affidavit so I can send it to our cybersecurity insurance company.
Yeah, I think we get a lot of, is this architecture secure, and are the permissions that I'm generating, these fine-grained permissions for actions, are they correct? And usually my answer has to be, I don't know. What does your feature do, and is this what customers actually want to allow? So we've spent a lot of time breaking down sort of how do you land that Goldilocks level of granularity and really think through your customer scenarios. But otherwise, it's a lot of, yeah, you tell me. We're working out together.
One of the ones that I encounter a lot when I'm out at conferences or talking with the community is basically like, how paranoid do we need to be? You know what I mean? Because every time you're talking about adding layers of security at different points, talk about defense in depth, for example, right? Like how often should we be refreshing tokens? Can we use static API keys? All these sorts of questions, right? Every one of these questions, if you go, yes, we should do that, yes, we should do that, yes, we should do that, that's additional time, money, resources, training, et cetera, right? So how do you figure out where you need to be investing in these practices versus where, okay, maybe that's over engineering, or maybe that's a level of paranoia that's inappropriate for the actual situation. And the answer, of course, there is it depends, right? Because it really does. But I get a lot of questions around that, and it's less about giving an answer, because that's kind of hard to do, but more about giving, how do you think about the question, right? Like what frameworks can you use to consider that? How can you do risk analysis? How can you do impact analysis, right? And yeah, exactly. Just a matter of how secure you need to be, right? Is your threat model, a state level actor, or is your threat model like, a script kiddie trying to get free bonus boxes in your video game? I would argue that the second case there is actually much more difficult to deal with.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because the risk is one that we also dealt with a lot at, my talk is going to be about what we did for our platform, where the information itself, pretty low risk, pretty low stakes. If somebody compromised, it was a training platform. What are they going to get? Like, oh, so-and-so got, did this course or did that course. But it was a security platform. So if we're doing security training, we have reputational risk. And so we decided that we needed to really treat it as if it was probably a way more secure thing. So that risk assessment, and how do you, thinking about not just the data or the cost, but also sort of some of the strategic stuff, like the reputational risk. Company I was at prior to that, same thing. If we ended up on the front page of some newspaper or whatever because we had become compromised, that would have totally undermined what we were trying to do, because we were a cybersecurity company. And so I think that there's a lot more, I think, that people don't necessarily take into consideration when assessing risk. Or they should be taking into consideration, I should say.
Mike, that makes me want to request that we find a new, like an extra speaker for this, which is how do you quantify, the reputational risk and impact of a identity-related security breach. I want to watch that talk.
Yeah, maybe I should have talked to you first, and then I would have a different talk.
Mike, hit me up after this webinar.
Yeah,
you and we'll throw something together. Don't worry about it.
Sounds good.
If there are no more comments on that one, I will ask you folks, what's the biggest challenge that you've faced in your work in identity and access management in the last 2 years?
For me,
it's
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, we started the for me together, or should I have an echo? For me, it's actually convince people that they should externalize authorization, and that will enable them better identity access management. I think the mistake I did when I started in developer relations and enabling developers with authorization was to convince them that authorization is like authentication. They externalize authentication. They need to externalize authorization. Today, I know that's not true, and I ask forgiveness for anyone I were point in the wrong direction. Authorization is more like databases, and no one writing databases themselves. They externalize it to either managed, hosted, whatever it is, but no one is writing persistent. They use the right product for managing persistent. And the same for permissions. It required much more connection between the application logic and the externalized solution, but it's still something that needs to be externalized. So this challenge with convincing people for that, not for the commercial product, but just think about it like something external. It shouldn't be coupled with the code. The policy shouldn't declare in if statements in your code, etc. Yeah, that's a challenge, but I'm happy to deal with.
One of the biggest challenges I hit at times is people using a word like identity or credential or provider and having a narrow definition of that and causing problems in the conversation because people aren't talking about the same thing even though they're using the same word.
I think for me, it's not necessarily the hardest thing is the people and the distributed nature of who owns certain portions of maybe of authorization within the product, or even I own the enterprise side and the product side, and like our IT team owns effectively authentication, but all of the app owners own authorization, and then there's some middle ground where it's all sort of managed in Active Directory, for instance, and sort of I feel like I'm like reverse engineering how some of this stuff works at the organization just because it's owned by so many different parties. So getting a holistic picture of how all this stuff works and how it all works together, and who truly has access to what can be a challenge.
Yeah, we've been on a journey to implement, fine-grained permissions for everything instead of really coarse-grained, read, write, and admin. And that has involved going to every single feature team and convincing them, yes, it is worth it to break your feature apart into multiple different pieces, think deeply about how these things are connected, implement new database patterns, new calling patterns, so that your feature doesn't change at all, but people can use it in different ways. And that is an uphill battle, especially in the age of, hey, we're adding AI to things. We can work on that instead of your authorization stuff. So the organizational internal struggle to add better authorization patterns to existing code is definitely been a hard one.
I think a hard one that I've dealt with a lot is kind of like, that balance of security yet accessibility and all the different credential types we provide. Username and password is one thing, but we also have a lot of different keys and tokens and ways to authenticate that we're not really 100% sure. We don't have good telemetry on exactly what people are using those for. So if one of those, we want to lock down the security of it, maybe by, by default reducing some of the scopes it gets, it's very difficult to know what workflows that will break for our customer and to get them to change and accommodate. So we're finding ourselves trying to figure out how can we do a migration or something that's not going to be disruptive rather than pushing something that may break automation. But whenever you don't know, because the credential is so flexible, exactly how it's being used, it becomes very hard to make any changes around it for security purposes.
So we do have a question from the chat. So Aaron asks, on level of paranoia, so many users already have an issue with 14-character minimum password length. The alternative is passkey, but before enabling passkey, you need a password. What do you all think about this?
Password managers. All of my passwords are 64 characters of gibberish. And I just put my thumbprint and then it fills it in, and then I don't really think about it. I don't know how widespread this is as a practice among non-nerds, however. So there's a situation there too, which is, I think, oftentimes dismissed by people in the technology industry, which is, well, just get good, scrub, right? And like that's not a good answer, right? So. So this is another one of those areas where, speaking, I guess, a little bit to what you said, Hannah, around security versus accessibility, right? Like, one, we do want to have security, and we do need to have security, and we do need to have these practices in place. But like, how as an industry can we make that usable and make that something that the level of friction necessary isn't so much that it will stop it being used. I don't have a good answer, but it's a good question.
It is. I think the password manager thing is such an interesting one because one of the conversations I have all the time is this old world thinking around passwords and like the way we thought secure passwords were in the 90s. And I mean, NIST has come out with the recommendations, I don't know, probably 7, 8, 9 years ago about like everything you thought about passwords is wrong. It's length. It's not like all these funky, it's not the changing A's to @ signs and making it hard for people to remember, but getting people just to use password managers. And I think as a whole, there's probably opportunities for us to sort of recommend. The rotation policies. I'm fighting that today. It's so frustrating. Every 90 days, my laptop password is changing because my IT team thinks that that's important.
Secure.
When my laptop is sitting in my office, in my home all the time. So in any event, password managers, and I think we as in the industry could probably be doing better. I think about like maybe there's some stuff we could be doing on a login page or a registration page where maybe we're making recommendations like, hey, having trouble coming up with a password, have you considered a password and without necessarily picking a particular solution. I don't know. I think it's an interesting challenge.
I do want to push on an assumption maybe that's in Aaron's question, which is, do you actually need that password? What value is that password giving you besides maybe some portability across devices, depending on what kind of passkey it is? Depending on how important, and the flip side of paranoia is protectiveness. How much do your users care about exactly what's inside of that user account? When do they need it? A passkey might be great if they're signing into TikTok, if they're signing into, who was it? Air New Zealand, right? Who went heavy into passkey only accounts. They work great. And then you don't have to deal with the password question at all. And passkeys are pretty ubiquitous now for probably the users that you care about.
I think people should be using, if they have to use a password manager because the app doesn't provide any choice, then you should use a password manager. I probably have a somewhat contrarian view that I'm not a fan of passkeys as being the single factor. I don't think that the standard and the deployments make it easy for that. There's too many sharp edges for people to lose access. They're hard to recover. They're hard to share. They're an amazing second factor. But I predict long-term that we should stop having so many passwords, that people should be using a service for how they log in and outsourcing. An app shouldn't be trying to manage passwords. Yeah, you're having to do account protection, and at scale, people are going to do things like you reuse the same password. Do you really want to be in the account protection business? And modern account protection that's done by Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, all is using heavy machine learning and doing anomaly protection similar to what happens every time you use your credit card. And so the more you use the same service for logging in, the more the service learns what's normal, what's not normal for you, and the better it can protect you versus, oh, did I get the right string as a password, which is a super low level of security. And so similar to how, it's very difficult to run a mail server directly now because of spam, et cetera. There's really a small number of providers that manage delivery of mail, that in the future, I predict that, most logins will be performed by, a small set of services that are in the business and and run at a scale where they're able to easily do anomaly detection and protect the user's account. And you really have a small set of passwords that you have at each of those providers.
In the last few minutes, we do have one more question from Daniel. Daniel asks, how do you feel about keeping data local and repatriatization of data?
I'm not sure that's a question of how you feel about it. I think it's a question of, what you're going to be required to do. There's been some really interesting discussions recently about the latest guidance associated with GDPR and how that makes where data is and who owns it or what have you so much more complicated. If you don't follow Max Schrems, you really should. He has some interesting write-ups on that. And as for data, within the US, where you might want it to be in a less expensive data center, these are really interesting times, is all I can say about that. And what you're going to decide to do will really fit your risk tolerance, how much regulation you are required to follow, and where your customers are that you have to worry about it.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, we are about 2 minutes out from the end, so I would really like to thank all of our speakers for taking the time to come and talk to us ahead of the conference. We very much look forward to seeing you and learning from you in New York next month. For viewers, this QR code will actually give you 100% off of a ticket to AuthCon and API Days New York City. So if you happen to be in the area, please join us and you can do so for free. If you can't attend the live event, keep an eye on the Fusion Auth YouTube channel. All the AuthCon talks will be published there 2 weeks after the conference. And for more information about AuthCon, you can visit authcon.io. And once again, I want to say thank you so much to all of our speakers, and we look forward to seeing you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.